It has suddenly become extremely difficult to talk about Polish politics without too much emotion involved, too much political temperature or ideological temperature, so to say. So for those of you who don't live in Poland, who are sometimes watching something related to Poland on international news, wondering perhaps what is happening with this country of Solidarność originally and the upheaval, the social upheaval of the 80s and 90s towards democracy, and the past 8 years, what has happened that we've had so much argument with the European Commission? Generally, our diplomatic efforts as a country have not always been easy to understand, especially over the period of the past 8 years. So let's try and attempt mission impossible here and explain Polish politics, starting with the fundamentals. In 2015, we've seen a major political shift in Poland from more or less center-liberal government to right-wing government, at least in theory, and definitely what you could describe as an increasingly populist government, run by the politician who could no longer be the frontman of his own political party, because that's what his advisors eventually succeeded in persuading him away from, which, given the level of personal narcissism, must be what he wanted at that time. And his political enablers, advisors, consultants, whoever they were, advised him that if he wants to win against that time prime minister and that time president, he should find two politicians, preferably young, relatively unknown, to say that 1% knew who those specific candidates were. 1% of the population in Poland knew or could recognize those faces the moment they were nominated for the office of Prime Minister, Beata Szydło, and President Andrzej Duda would be an exaggeration, because literally almost no one knew those two politicians. So that in itself was extraordinary and sent a really clear signal that all of a sudden a party that used to be seen as anachronistic, to say the least, very old-fashioned in all ways of politics, starting from the age of the leader, the man who in 1962, along with his twin brother, played in a film produced by state television, if I remember correctly, for children, about two boys who stole the moon. That was literally the title of this 1962, ironic as it sounds now. So basically the man who runs Polish, who used to run up until October 15th for the previous 8 years, had been in politics for a solid chunk of 40 years, so you can just imagine. Now, so what happened in 2015 and the transition period 2016 in particular was one of the first things that the new political party in power, and the first proper majority in parliament party, which meant that they could vote through and turn into effective legislation everything they wanted to, in fact, bar the constitutional changes. So what happened at that period of time is one of the first decisions they made was to literally take over the public media and do so in a way that was brutal, in a way that had not been seen, that had not any precedent in Poland. Extraordinarily, intimidation, getting rid of whoever thought or dared criticize the Jarosław Kaczyński law and justice leader government. So effectively, overnight, the biggest, the most influential state media in Poland became not party favorable, but almost literally a propaganda machine for the new government. What it meant effectively is disruption in the fundamental proportions of how many law and justice politicians and how often they would be enjoying screen time or basically in studio time, and how much everyone else would enjoy. So all of this suddenly became driven by political whim, not even any rules or ideological preferences, but very often instructions and orders coming from above. All of a sudden, the public sector television stopped having financial issues. So finance was no longer an issue, money was no longer an issue, resources were no longer an issue. Lavish spending was the order of the day from that moment onwards. And now, literally, you would see situations where the most important news program, 7:30 TVP1, would air the presidential candidates' literally campaign spots in the main news program as the only campaign spot that was aired was that of the president. And trust me, if you watch it, you will understand what I'm talking about. It's like a 4-minute film packed full of sugar-coated material, heavily biased, with some kind of Asian-style music in the background. Quite remarkable. If you listened and watched daily news programs, 7:30 and the other ones, the most popular, the most influential news formats, you would find it really hard to believe that a relatively mature democracy could sustain something like that continuously without social protest, without people really becoming super angry that in a mature economy, in a mature democracy, something like that could even happen in the first place, let alone become a daily reality. Now, that would give birth to the entire new wave of so-called symmetrists, whataboutists, people who would defend every law and justice misdemeanor by comparing to whatever they could find in the past. So the logic used was, imagine you're guilty of a criminal act. Imagine you steal something very expensive, or you mismanage public resources, and the way you defend yourself effectively in court would be by saying that there were also thieves and poor managers in the past. So that would be the effective logic, allowing you to, stay away from the consequences of your actions. So we suddenly became a completely ridiculous, non-democratic state. And trust me, it's not an exaggeration to say so. Yesterday, another shift happened. The winning coalition from the past election, from the most recent elections on October 15th, was initially delayed by Law and Justice for 2 months before they were in a position, before they were allowed to take over power in Poland, to form a proper coalition government, to nominate ministers and basically fill in all the vacancies required to start proper governance. So this was deliberately delayed for a period of 2 months by Law and Justice, even though from day one they were absolutely clear that none, not a single opposition party, wanted to have anything to do with them. And they would have done a lot to have a third term in office, which they were, by the way, quite confident would happen. What happened yesterday is that the new coalition government had used a legal shortcut, which some find controversial, to basically take over control in the state television with an ambition and goal to restore balance, essentially, to once again see the government being criticized by state television, which was, to say it was not the case for the past 8 years would be an understatement. I mean, literally, I had never ever heard the news anchor on Polish television in the main news program criticizing anything that any of the lead voices of Law and Justice ever did. So basically, it's not bias or it's not lack of professional media ethics in a state broadcaster. It's much more than that. There is what I would describe as criminal intent there, in the sense that those people were getting unprecedented salaries for feeding their publics with extremely one-sided narratives. I mean, I find it difficult to find the right words to explain it to you, how heavily biased it was and how much it was focused on catering to all kinds of conspiracy theories, to different polarization efforts, intimidation, vilifying enemies. And in case of Donald Tusk, the man who is now the Prime Minister, they went so far that I think if he wanted to take this case to court and get damages for what has been done to him personally and how it's been done by the public broadcaster, I think it would be a really piece of cake for him to get millions for what they have done over the past few years. But I don't think he will do that. Not that he needs more money at this stage in his life, or not that he's vindictive in that sense of the word, despite him being vilified to such a degree that, especially in Polish countryside, you will find elderly people saying absolutely ridiculous things about this man, very emotional things, which are essentially the repetition of the public media rhetoric, quite literally, quotes how they should talk about him, how they should think about him. But if you ask those people about any specific argument or specific proof of why they would use such aggressive language to describe this man, it's very likely they will give you absolutely nothing or next to nothing or nothing comparable to law and justice misdemeanors of the last scandals and misdemeanors of the last 80 years. So here we are right now. The Polish state television is again back in the hands of the new coalition government. What they will do with it is hopefully create a trustworthy source of daily information from Poland and abroad. And I'm absolutely confident whatever they do, it will be a lot more credible and, ethically speaking, reliable than what was the case over the past 80 years. I will be watching them carefully, so to say, again, to make sure that there is enough transparency and proper analytical news reporting. Now, some of you may think, what's the big deal here? After all, you want diversity on your country national media landscape. So what's the problem if you have the public news broadcaster biased towards one side of the equation? If you at the same time have private television channels which tend to steer towards more liberal thinking, of course the right-wing populist government would use very deliberate vilifying rhetoric to describe them as leftist, woke, ideologues. Of course there would be lots of xenophobia attached to all that, and very, very what you would perhaps describe as traditional conservative thinking. But if you take a closer look, religion, or what they proclaim to be being religious, having traditional values, does not withstand any scrutiny, because you just see far too much greed, far too much hypocrisy there, far too much religiosity and practical politics behind big words. So again, if you take a much closer look at what those politicians that rely heavily on traditional values really do, in fact, and how they exploit religion, how they exploit vulnerabilities and weaknesses of their preferred electoral base, which, by the way, in case of Law and Justice, just happens to be the uneducated, the rural areas. Suffice it to say that none of the big cities over the past 8 years in Poland, none of the academic centers have really ever voted for anything to do with Law and Justice. That in itself should be speaking volumes, really, when you think about it. So there was a very clear attempt, again, veiled in beautiful equality wording, but again, in reality, there was just so much hostility, so much rhetorical aggression, so many legislative measures that were designed to deepen the trenches of political preferences, narcissism and plain incompetence, because one of the most important pillars of their strategic concept for the past 8 years was to take immediate control of the state companies and to put as CEOs of those companies people who literally had no formal qualifications to do those jobs. And I mean, quite literally, the competitions, the formal processes required to put someone in a position of the CEO of the major Central European oil giant, for instance, well, it wasn't needed or required that you had any history whatsoever as a CEO of any comparable institution, remotely comparable even. So basically, these were political nominations, giving people lots of power, lots of money in exchange for absolute loyalty, verging on taking personal risks in making decisions required by the party. So for instance, one of the biggest oil giants would suddenly venture into buying a network, the largest network of regional newspapers in Poland, in order to extend this influence. Another measure undertaken was, of course, early on to take control of the prosecutor's office, to try and control the Constitutional Tribunal, which they effectively succeeded in doing. Attempts were made to control the Supreme Court. Attempts were made to close down the biggest media competitor, TVN. Attempts were made to stifle all kinds of resistance. And need I remind you that throughout this time, up until the Russian invasion in Ukraine, where Viktor Orban showed his true face to the world, so to say, up until that point, Viktor Orban was the paragon of political virtue, the man who effectively eliminated all media resistance all media opposition in Hungary. Now we are in a country, and especially after yesterday, what happened with the takeover of the public media by the new coalition government, it almost makes you think of the old proverb, live by the sword, die by the sword. I have never ever in any way been related to any political party in Poland or political organization. None of them have been paying me any money for any of the services that my consultancy provides. I've come across, if I can put it this way, multiple development opportunities for myself and my brand over the past 8 years. I rejected every single one of them on ethical grounds. And as a disclaimer, I have never worked directly or indirectly with either Polish television, TVP1, I will add just one exception in a moment, or with TVN and TVN24, another exception. So just one exception for those two competitive channels, one public media channel, the most important one in Poland, TVP1, and the other one owned by Warner Brothers, TVN, the most important competition for law and justice government over the past 8 years. So the first disclaimer, back in 2011, I was commissioned to do a live commentary for the royal wedding of back then Prince William and Kate Middleton, which was a massive ceremony, a very serious broadcast with millions of Poles watching it. So my job was to do a live commentary back then, a terrifying challenge, to be frank with you, involving a week of preparations. And another cooperation was with TVN and a very popular talk show run by Kuba Wojewódzki, where his guest was Mike Tyson, no less. These were the one-time experiences of cooperation with both channels and being able to in-person compare the two realities. And as far as news media are concerned, I used to be a company spokesperson for a major multinational company in Poland, an editor-in-chief, director communications for this company. After I left the corporate sector, which was 2010, I basically bought a 1-month training at the at the most important, perhaps, private news broadcaster in Poland called TVN24. Quite an interesting experience. So that much of a disclaimer.